Tonight, we're going to talk about death. I have as my guest this evening my friend B.J. Miller. And for those who may not know B.J., he is a palliative and care physician and has been involved in hospice care and was the executive director for a period of time at the Zen Hospice Center in San Francisco. He has a book coming out called The Beginner's Guide to Death, which comes out in July. And it's a practical guide, not only how to live, but also how to die. And one of the reasons I was excited about having him with us is not only his extraordinary personal story, but he's also a very sweet, handsome guy. And I sort of like that. But he's really done some amazing talks. And actually, we spoke together at the Endwell conference recently up in San Francisco, which is quite an extraordinary conference in and of itself, talking about end-of-life issues. And so we're going to have a conversation about death. You know, I gave a talk at TEDx Sacramento some years ago, and the reason I'm going to make this statement, and it'll tell you, though, one of the reasons I'm interested in this topic. And what I said at that conference to start out was that as a physician, or as a neurosurgeon and a physician for the last quarter century, my job has been to prevent death. But one of the greatest experiences I've had as a physician is to be with those who are dying, who have truly lived. And the last decade as a neuroscientist is to understand what stops people from living. And we will not escape our death. But the key is, how do you accept that reality and still be able to live, to be joyous, and as our person here, compassionate, which all of us can learn to be better at. So without further ado, BJ and I are going to start a conversation. I'll ask some very leading questions that are softball that allow him to look really good, and then we'll go a little further. So thank you so much. For those of you who don't know much about CCARE, you can find out about the work we do at CCARE, CCARE.stanford.edu. We study the neuroscience of compassion, altruism, and how those behaviors improve our health and well-being. We do this through research. We also have speakers. We put on conferences. And actually, one of the funnest things that I do is this, which is conversations on compassion. And for those of you who may not have been to those before, you can find them online. And we've had the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Eckhart Tolle, and now soon B.J. Miller. So thank you. Some of you may have your cell phone on, so you may want to check. I was at a conference one time, and the gentleman said, if I hear a cell phone, it so irritates me, everyone turn off your cell phones because I'll be so angry and I'll throw you out. And right then my cell phone went off. Well, thank you for coming, BJ.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Sure. So we were talking a little bit before we began, but all of us have a backstory, and oftentimes that backstory results in our present story. And I think certainly that is the case with you. And you were an undergraduate at Princeton and had a horrible accident. And maybe you can share that with us and how it impacted you in terms of the consequences of that after, and how it led perhaps to you gaining greater insight into our mortality.
Yeah, that's a question I know the answer to. Thank you for that. So sophomore year college, just after Thanksgiving break, we had just gotten back on campus. and we had been away from each other for all 4 days. All of us friends were excited to see each other. And it was a Monday night. We went out just kind of horsing around. And there's a commuter train in Princeton that runs from the Princeton proper to Princeton Junction to take people to Philly and New York. And it's called the Dinky, of all things. It's sad to lose limbs to a thing called the Dinky. It's very humbling. But anyways, we were walking to the Wawa market to get a sandwich, and there's this train just sitting there, not very daring, just a parked train with a ladder on it, just sitting there. And so we climbed it like you would climb a tree, or really didn't think for a second that it was a dangerous thing to do. It wasn't moving or anything. But when I stood up, I had a metal watch on, and when I stood up, this is like the buses in San Francisco, the wires that run overhead. So when I stood up, electricity arced to the watch, a metal watch, and that was it. Electricity entered the arm and blew out the legs. So, yeah, that was it. It was instantaneous. Well, the amputations were surgical, and I was in a burn unit for 3 months or so in New Jersey. St. Barnabas in Livingston, New Jersey, and got great care there, by the way. But there's a lot to say, but that, as you say, Jim, that set me up for all sorts of things moving forward. And I think early on the decision was, thanks to my mom, I learned, and sort of the disability rights movement, I learned that disability was A, normal, B, was something that you don't overcome. It's because it's not going away. It's not something that you put behind you. I think everyone sort of wants you to, or that's often the narrative. But thanks to my mother and others, I knew that was not possible. Also, it wasn't smart. So pretty quickly, this became a compelling force for me to learn from, to bounce off of, to wrestle with. And it also put me in front of a lot of very, very kind people and giving people. I feel so, there's so much to say about this, so I'll try to keep it short. And by the way, if we get to questions, there's nothing off limits. This subject that we're talking about is huge, and it's personal and professional, so anything's welcome. But I learned a couple things I think that really led forward. One was the myth of independence, I'd like to call it. That it's not like I went from the independent world to the dependent world, which is sort of how we language this. And that's one of the reasons why it feels harder than it has to be, is you feel like the world isn't made for you anymore, and so you have to go over here. But of course, there is no such thing as an independent person. I've never met an independent person. I don't know if anyone would ever want to be. It would be a very lonely thing to be. So it taught me that, which was a very useful thing, and then which then ended up putting me in touch with all the things that we do have in common, including that we suffer. And so that led me into sort of interest in universal threads that unite people. And suffering is a big one. And so that led me ultimately into medicine and into palliative care. And I guess one more thing to say about it, and again, we can ping off it, but you mentioned joy, Jim, and how some people die before they die. There's all those ways these early deaths before we actually die. There's a gazillion ways to do that. But if you have loss earlier in life, and if you have enough support to kind of work with it and move through it, it's almost like a skill. Like you can get good at losing. You can get good at falling. We just witnessed a woman in the hallway who just was very good at falling. It's almost as there's a skill to it.
And she got up.
But there's a skill to it, and you get to learn resilience. You get to find nooks and crannies in yourself that you wouldn't have otherwise had an excuse to find. And you see these incredible acts of kindness from other people that you wouldn't have had an excuse to evince. And I guess where I'm going is, for all the sorrow and all the heartache that certainly went with it, I don't mean to be Pollyannish, those things were exactly what made me realize the power and importance of joy and compassion, et cetera. They're all kind of related. So in a way, getting in touch with all that loss put me in touch with beauty, put me in touch with kindness, et cetera. And so it's just continued to be a lesson, a bundle of lessons for me, and it's pulled me into all sorts of interesting work.
One of the things that this sort of, I think, intersects with is this concept of equanimity because the nature of life is ups and downs, and a lot of us sort of have a tendency to want the upside.
Yeah.
And because
Yeah.
it feels good, and you feel alive, and you feel great, and a lot of attention comes to you because of that. But the reality is, I think, as BJ was showing us, is that oftentimes the greatest lessons we learn and the greatest insights we get are with the downsides, which often has to do with very deep suffering. But it's the nature of that suffering that demonstrates one's common humanity and the reality that none of us can avoid suffering. So before we go on to this very deep topic, I want to ask you about tea. So you were a tea merchant. Let's hear a little bit about that. None of you thought I was going to go there, did you?
Yeah. No. So I was at sophomore year, before I got injured, I was heading into East Asian studies. I was studying Chinese language. The Tiananmen Square massacre had happened on my way into college, and I was just interested in China. And that led to an interest in the Chinese aesthetic, which led an interest into tea. And one of my best friends at the time, he was in Britain, and he was learning about tea from the British angle. And it just became this thing we had in common and we loved to play with. And it became a big hobby of mine. And you guys know, I mean, tea is just amazing. It's all tea comes from the same camellia plant. All these practically infinite varieties of tea from the same little plant. It's just a stunning thing. It puts wine to shame. And it's something you can just play with forever and ever and ever. So loved it. It was a big part of my life in general. And then deep into medical school, we could talk about this for a long time, but deep into medical school, I was going to go into rehabilitation medicine. That's what I was interested in, putting this stuff to use. So I figured, I'll go to medicine, I'll work with other disabled people, won't that be nice? And then I did a rotation in rehab medicine deep in med school, and it turned out I hated it. And for all sorts of reasons. And so I promised myself, and then one thing I learned was that time was short, and I wasn't going to sort of accidentally sacrifice my life. I met a lot of people who felt stuck in medicine. Like, well, my dad was a doctor, and I've done all this training. What else am I going to do? And they just stay in medicine. And so I promised myself to not do that. So I was going to drop out. I was going to finish med school. It was senior year, but I was going to stop and go into the tea business. My friend and I had started the business, and we were doing it, but I was going to go recommit myself to it. But then I did an internship in Milwaukee in palliative care or in medicine, and met palliative care and fell in love, and off I went. But for a while I thought that was going to be my life. It's still a huge hobby of mine. Yeah.
So I have two questions related to that. Should one put milk in their tea?
Deep questions, Jim.
This is actually an existential question.
Depends. If you got crap tea and you want to masquerade it, sure, put some milk in it. You know.
How many people are British in this?
Sorry. Sorry. And
then we'll leave tea. But
shoot.
The other question is, how hot should the water be?
Depends on the type of tea you are brewing. Black tea, red tea, you will use a hotter water. Oolong's less hot. Green tea, some green tea is practically tepid.
Okay, so enough about tea.
Ooh. Lemon, again, if you like lemon, go for it. But otherwise, those are often like flavorings. I've learned from being a tea merchant that that's often a way to just masquerade not a very good substrate in the first place.
So there's tea. We were talking actually outside about a seminal book by a fellow by the name of Ernest Becker. Have any of you read that book? It's called The Denial of Death. And the interesting thing about medicine, especially in the West, is that, well, there are two problems. One is medicine in the West is about illness. It's not about wellness, right? The other thing, though, is that we have separated life from the natural process of death so that it seems foreign. And that as a result, many people, especially doctors, if they feel that they have failed as a physician, which means their patient is dying, they immediately cut off so they don't have to deal with that failure in front of them, and frankly also a variety of issues associated with people who are near death. And many people are not prepared to die, and it makes it very painful for them because they're trying to cling, and they want so badly, and it creates more pain and suffering actually, not only for themselves but their family. And so BJ, maybe you could comment on, and this book won the Pulitzer Prize actually in 1974, I think, but maybe you could comment on how you intersected with that and your thoughts about sort of this duality between the physical self and the spiritual self. And he talks about this immortality play that each of us creates for ourselves, and in some ways a narrative of being a hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that book was very formative for me. It's in, you'll see it in Annie Hall. It's referenced in Annie Hall a few times. There's a lot to say about it. For one, it helped me understand, helped pull because medicine has sort of assumed death as its subject in modern, but which is sort of, it's unfortunate in some ways. But of course, it's not not an inherently medical subject. And so it was interesting to read Ernest Becker, a cultural anthropologist, a totally different angle. And in the book, he sort of, in some ways, takes Freud's sort of obsession with sex and sort of crosses out sex, puts in death, essentially. That we humans are constantly bouncing off trying to wrap our heads around, our egos are trying to wrap our heads around this fact that we have to die. And all sorts of cool things. There's a terror management theory. I can't remember the guy's names who came up with this, but there's a whole school of thought around human behavior that flows from Becker's work. So it's really ripe stuff. I encourage you guys to look it up. But essentially that we spend so much time, because we're so enamored with ourselves, or so consumed with ourselves, maybe is a better word, and that this crazy idea that we have to love life even as we're losing it, that we have to somehow find ourselves even as we're losing ourselves. It just doesn't really work in a lot of ways with the human mind. It really challenges us in some important ways. And we do some really weird things as a species, bouncing off of it. Really kind of fascinating things. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I'm not really interested in doing away with neuroses. I mean, to me, neuroses are personality. So I mean, I'm all for life is weird and wild, and the crazy things we do are part of the intrigue for us. And so be it. But I think what ends up happening, if there's a tragedy in that, is you can become so consumed with the development of your ego, with the development of yourself, that you lose out on a life beyond yourself, that you lose touch with the life that's much bigger, that's flowing inside and outside of you, when maybe there's not so much to fear after all. Once we kind of loosen, for me, it's not so much as do away with the ego, it's more like diffuse the ego, see myself in everything and everything in me. It's not out of megalomania, it's just just a diffuse ego. And that has been very helpful to me. So yeah, and we see this in our patients. Yeah, fear is a huge thing that, as you guys know, it can be helpful. I should have been afraid of that train. That would have been helpful. But there's a use for it, but it can be too much. And if you're not careful, you can become so strapped with fear that you're so afraid to lose your life that you forget to live your life. That's the great irony and sorrow.
Where do you think religion fits into this?
Well, religion has, religion's big, obviously, and I don't, I want to be careful.
That was the softball question.
Yeah, I just want to be careful to not sound like I'm an authority. Yeah. But the thing that they seem to have in common would be that they provide answers to unanswerable questions, or questions that we find very difficult to answer, like reconciling ourselves with the fact that we have to die, like we've been talking. That there doesn't seem to necessarily be an answer to this dilemma. And I think that's part of, for me, I sort of more existentially, sort of philosophically wired. I'm interested in meaning. For me, I think meaning is something that we make more than perhaps something that we find. If there's some great meaning to the universe, I'm not aware of it, and that's okay. I'm happy with the mystery, but meanwhile, I'm very aware that we're meaning-making factories. We can ingest or invest meaning just about anywhere, and it's a powerful, cool, wonderful force. But I'm getting off track. I guess back to religion. I think religion provides us with a sort of a structure for meaning, and a structure for unanswerable questions, and a way to ease our fears because it implies that we belong to something larger than ourselves. And for me, that's the cosmos, and that's enough. But whether there's a creator, I'm agnostic personally, and I like that. I'm a devout agnostic. But I do think that one of the things that's going on today is that we have lost, with the secularization of society, there's a lot of loss that goes with that. And I think in some ways, without that ready-made catchment for ourselves, we really extra struggle and we flail around. Yeah.
It's interesting because fear is not healthy. And one of the things that we study is how people's anxiety, fear, stress has a very negative physiologic effect, and in fact is associated with the occurrence of disease, the chronicity of disease, the severity of disease, and is often associated with the shorter life. The interesting thing, though, is that this issue of our mortality for many people does create an immense amount of fear. And some people postulate that one of the purposes of religion is actually to create a belief system that says that you're going to live beyond this physical life. And therefore, you have no reason to fear death. And in fact, studies have shown that religious people actually live longer, as do Republicans. And that's associated with being righteous. No, I'm not joking, actually. There is science about this. But the point of that statement may seem unclear. But the point is that it's here. We create the narrative that gives us what that is, and whether it's meaning, whether it's comfort with our own mortality. And I think you were saying you're a devout agnostic. I'm actually a devout atheist. And because I don't need to sort of have this thing that says, well, if somebody's there, then I agree you could be there. I just don't choose not to believe that. But it's okay because I don't have that fear. And we were talking about meaning, and it's this idea of you create meaning. And that's a very powerful thing. And each of us have the potential within us to define what that is, what it can be, and actually it's incredibly powerful. What was I going to say? Oh, and the other thing I was going to comment on is that I've spent a fair amount of time with fairly significant spiritual and religious leaders like the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or Amma. And the thing I found fascinating about that is not one has hit me in the head and said, you're an atheist. Yet I have deep relationships with some of these people. And the extraordinary thing about that is their interest at some level is no longer about the dogma of the religion. It's about what's in your heart and whether you care. And I think that is the fundamental core of not only who we are, but the gift that we actually can give to other people. One of the things I want to talk to you about is what percentage of people actually carefully prepare for their death?
I don't know the number, but it's small. It's a minority by a long shot. But that's changing. Conversations like this. There's you guys coming to a talk like this. There's an interest that seems to be shifting, but very few people that I meet are prepared, have thought about it enough to prepare to die. Sadly. I think we all agree that that's an important thing to do. I think if there's like a sort of jump to the answer, or not an answer, but like people who work in hospice and around end of life, and perhaps in medicine in general, perhaps you too, Jim, it feels like there's a secret. Like a lot of us stave off thinking about death. It almost feels like a superstition. Like if you think about it, somehow you're welcoming it. If you say the words, you make it happen. And so we kind of just keep it over there, and we think that that's going to help us have more fun or something. But I think the trick, and the converse or inverse converse is when people see, oh, you work in hospice, oh, you must be so miserable, oh, it must be so sad. And yeah, sure, it's sad, but the secret I'm getting to is no. I mean, I think a lot of us get hooked on this work because you learn pretty quickly that by roping death into your worldview, into your frame of reality, not the opposite of your reality, not the antithesis of your reality, but part of it, when you accommodate it, A, it becomes less frightening, but B, you tend to live much more richly and potently, and you right-size yourself. You neither need to puff yourself up to somehow defeat this thing, but nor do you have to feel diminished because you're going to lose to death. So the secret, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is those of us who have roped it into our worldview is not morose. It's a little bit of it's a way for us to actually love life while we have it. And that's a sweet, sweet side effect. So I think that's one of the messages a lot of us are trying to get out there, that yeah, preparing for your death is practical and useful in all sorts of ways. It helps your family, it does all sorts of things, but it will also help you live your life in a much more rich way in the meantime.
How many people actually have done, if you will, all the work you think is necessary to prepare for death? Oh, that's a huge number.
Wow.
One person. Two, okay, two. But it just shows you, because most of us sort of want to push that away. And, it's quite extraordinary because, it can just end immediately. And I have to tell you, I have not done adequate preparation myself, actually. You've been with a lot of people who have died, and I have as well. And as you point out, I mean, sometimes it is painful to watch, and it's especially painful for someone who's made no preparation whatsoever. And it's that, I think, is very, very painful to watch. But being with somebody who actually has prepared and has been thoughtful and has released themselves to that inevitability, it is actually an extraordinary honor and privilege to spend those last moments with those individuals. And I was wondering if you might share one or two examples or of an experience that you can recall.
Yeah. There are a fair amount of negative examples for folks who can put it off until it's too late. And, in a word, those examples are potent because they point you to regret. And that is, and I'm all for, one of the things that's kind of happening, I'm going to digress a little bit. One of the things that's happening is as there's a sort of reacquaintance with death as a subject, and increasingly in popular culture, and that seems really good. But one of the fears is that just the reductive forces of media and sort of group thinking are lopping off some of the harder emotions in that mix, because it is hard. The idea is to not look at it so that you think it's really neato and to put some glitter on it. That's a mistake. You look at it so you can expand your capacity to feel all sorts of things, not to narrow your aperture, but to blow it open. And I worry sometimes that we're, again, in this massive way, we're cutting off the things on the margins that are so critical. So that's a digression. But one of the things I see that's really hard at the end of life are folks who are just loaded with regrets. And invariably they say, if I had just stopped and thought about how precious my time was, I would have done X, Y, or Z. I would have told my kids I love them more, or I would have done this, or I wouldn't have done that. And now there's no time. And so they have all this extra sorrow, this extra regret. And that's really, really hard to be around. And also very informative for me. I mean, another quick digression. For me, I feel like my goal for doing this job is so that I can learn to love what I have while I still have it. That's my goal. I keep watching myself appreciate things right when I'm about to lose them or right after I've lost them. I do it all the time. So it feels like thanks to my patients, they keep reminding me to watch that. So anyway, so I'm sort of heading towards the negative examples. Regrets, and those are powerful. And in some ways, the goal of minimizing your regrets is a really good one. Sometimes sitting with patients who are trying to make decisions about treatment, we'll often use a sort of, if they don't know which way to go and they're not really sure how they feel, and ambivalence is so normal, sometimes we'll do this little trick, we'll say, well, let's leap ahead. Let's picture yourself in your deathbed and look back. How will you wished you have handled this? What would you have wished to have done? What would you have wished to have become? It's a little trick, and sometimes it's really helpful. I do it too. So I'm digressing on digressions, but there are other. So I think what you're asking about, Jim, I mean, some of the powerful stories of people who have done their homework. Well, I sort of feel sorry for those guys because they end up there. Not only do they have to be dying, but then they end up teaching everybody all these things too. So they have to because they actually have things in perspective and things in check. And again, that doesn't mean no sorrow. They just have it in perspective. And same with disability. One of the things that's so hard about it is not so much the inborn aches and pains of it, but it's how the world treats you. And so I watch these poor folks in deathbeds who have really done their homework, and people are projecting all their junk onto them, and they've got to, navigate it and fend. But their final contribution is as these teachers. I just remember one patient who's just, there were multiple, but at Zen Hospice Project, a woman named Jeanette who stood out. And she had ALS. She was really feisty and cantankerous, and one of my favorite things about her is as she was dying, she started smoking again, which I thought was just so beautiful. As a doctor, I can't tell you how fun it is to prescribe cigarettes. It's like practically, it was such a weird thing. But Jeanette loved it. She also reminded me of the sort of aesthetic potential, the immediacy of our senses, and the sort of power of having a body in the first place. So she would watch her smoke out on the patio, and she would it was ecstasy. And it was just and she had trouble breathing, so it was not an easy task. So, but it was like watching her. She was like making a cast of her lungs with every inhale. It was like allowing her to feel the contours of her lungs. It was just gorgeous. I don't mean to go. I'm not encouraging to go smoke, but I just mean that a person who's done their homework and is daring to live out every last cell. It's a beautiful thing to behold, and it doesn't necessarily have to look like peace. It can be filled with smoke and feisty, angsty, all sorts of stuff. It's all welcome. But the trick is those who have done their homework, I guess, the bottom line is they don't hate themselves for dying.
When you had your accident, did you have a near-death experience?
Technically, I almost died, but no, I didn't see, no, not in the way I think you're talking, not asking, no, nothing special happened. No, but I did come very close to death, but I didn't, it was really after I was out of the woods that my doctors were finally honest with me and let me know how close it was, and there were the things they were telling my family at the end, my parents at the end of most days, and maybe this is a little bit, maybe this is near deathy insofar as I remember hearing that and being, I think I maybe even smiled or laughed because A, it felt cool to have almost died. B, there was something, I feel like there was something in me, and I don't know where it's coming from. Maybe it was the drugs, maybe it was ignorance, but I really felt like I knew better, like I knew I wasn't. On some level. That was sort of the feeling. The smile that came on my face when he told me that was, I think, because I realized that there was this thing called intuition. There was a gut going on at work. And yeah, But no, to answer your question, Jim, unfortunately, I didn't see God. I didn't see a light. I didn't.
How many have seen the light? How many near-death experiences? Yeah. And survey, how many of you saw a religious figure or something related to a belief system during that event? And since you're still here, you did not die. But how many of your lives were profoundly changed by that? How many it didn't do anything? So I had a near-death experience. For those of you who did not read my book, and so I was a resident, and I was out celebrating with some of my colleagues using various substances, some of which were illegal. And a friend of mine lost control of the car that we were driving and ran us into a tree at 40 miles an hour. And I was wearing a lap belt, and I had an acute flexion injury of the back, and I had a spine fracture, was paralyzed, lost bowel and bladder function, had a transected small bowel and a fractured spleen. And it was not a good day. So I went to the emergency room. Fortunately, my colleagues at the hospital, it was at the hospital I was training at, did not do any drug or alcohol levels. But I do not recommend you take drugs and alcohol. I was not the driver, but I should have known better. But anyway, I went to surgery. They repaired the small bowel. They took out my spleen. But the chief of surgery who operated on me missed a bleeder. So when I came out of surgery, my blood pressure, which was like normal, 120/80 or so, started dropping. And literally, the chairman of my department in neurosurgery was arguing with the chief of surgery as my blood pressure went from like 100/60, 80/40, 60/20, about the possibility that he could not have made a mistake and missed a bleeder. And what happened was I actually left my body as my blood pressure got really low, and I was up in the corner of the room looking at this argument between these two people, where the chairman finally said, he used an expletive, "If you don't take him back to surgery, I will." And the guy finally relented, and I had 5 liters of blood in my body. My blood pressure was 40/0 when they took me back. So I really almost died. But once I went to the OR, I had a classic near-death experience where I was going down a river of light. I heard all my loved ones who had passed before welcoming me. I was also reliving my life. And at the end of this river of light was this tunnel of light that was the brightest, warmest experience. I mean, it was incredible. And I wanted to merge with the light. And in some ways, it was the most joyous, wonderful of feelings. And the river started speeding up. And initially, it was slow, and then it started really going fast. And I was going to merge with the light. And right before that, I screamed to myself, "No," and then I woke up in the recovery room. So of course, people ask me, "Wow, that was an incredibly profound experience. How did that change you?" And actually, it didn't. I looked at it from a science point of view and realized that I had a lack of oxygen to my occipital cortex, and that was why I had this burst of light. And the deepest memories you have are the ones that stick with you. So as I was losing all my memories, the ones that were most deeply embedded, the most important to me, were still there for me. And in fact, it was what was left. At least that's how I put it. Now, if I was an agnostic, I could say I could be probably very wrong about that. But I think it was just physiologic. So, but that being said, in later reflection, I realized how powerful that could be. And at the same time, though, it also reinforced, though, how powerful us being here is, and how you, first of all, you don't control your end, but at least most people don't, but also that it's you being here that makes the end there, and how you act here, what's here, and how you see yourself, and how you see your purpose and your meaning. Because I think being with older individuals who've died, and I do think it takes some age, almost everyone at the end of their days wants to feel that they had purpose and meaning here. And of course, purpose and meaning for most people translates to being of service to others. And I think that's what gives most of us our meaning in life. And that certainly has been my experience. And so I can look at the clock. We only have a few more minutes. I think we're going to open it to questions. And for those people who may have questions, what I'd like to ask you to do, if it's not too much trouble, is to actually use the microphones. And does anybody have any questions? Go to the microphone. Now, it's always interesting at these sorts of things, although I don't think it'll be the case here, of course. We'll ask for questions, and then someone will just talk. And you'll finally say, well, what's the question? And sometimes that's
I don't have a question, I have
See?
a request. I have a request. There was only one person who prepared for death, and I want to know what she prepared.
I'm sorry, what was
There
your
was
question?
only one person who prepared for death, and so I wanted to know what she did.
There's only one per...
The woman I was mentioning? Yeah. Ah. The woman in the audience, yes.
That was not a question for us. But go ahead. No, answer the question. Go up to the mic and answer the question.
Sorry. So I lost my husband to cancer about 2.5 years ago. So we started preparing for death, so to speak, before that, and I'm thankful. Sorry, get myself all choked up.
Well, we didn't mean to put you on the spot.
So basically, when I think about preparing for death, a lot of things come to mind. And it's all the paperwork, let's say a living trust, will, advance directives. That's a start, right? Because I know that there are some people probably in this room that are like, oh, I'll get there, I'll do that. Well, let me tell you, even when you have those things prepared, you still have to fight for things, in a sense, with the law. But you're better off if you get it done. So with that in mind, ask questions of your partner, regardless if you have all the paperwork done, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they've talked about exactly what they want or how they want it. And I know that my parents had asked me, they're like, well, how'd you know? And because everybody's like, oh, you had that conversation. No, we didn't have a conversation. We were very young. My husband was first diagnosed when he was 42. So battled it for 3 years. Anyways, my point is we sort of came to preparing by I just listened to what he wanted. And I think that, anyways, became very important. So as far as what I'm doing to prepare, like I have all that done, and then I'm also living my truth. I became a family patient advisor with Hospice of the Valley, one of the only groups that's partnering with hospice to make a difference in the conversation around death. So I don't know. I think that's how I'm preparing. So, and I talk to my child about death, and it's a part of life. And so I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to follow on that, I wondered what you suggest by way of preparation. And I'm thinking more on the spiritual, psychological ease of passing than the paperwork part of it.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, so I'm really glad that you brought it back. There's a range of things to be done, and the practical logistical things are really key. It's amazing the difference for those who are left behind when someone has taken the time. So to be clear, let's just move from the sort of nitty-gritty logistical up through the inter and intrapersonal and spiritual. So as you mentioned, an advance directive. And if you're really living with a serious illness, I'd recommend you do this next step thing called a POLST. An advance directive is a legal document. A POLST is signed by a doctor. It's actually a medical order. POLST is physician order for life-sustaining treatment. It's a companion to your advance directive. And because it's signed by a doctor, it's actually an order. An advance directive, some hospitals will blow right past them. So just because you have your advance directive is not a guarantee that your wishes will be met. A POLST will increase the odds that they will be. So those are really important pieces of paper. And of course, they're not just pieces of paper. They reflect conversations, not just one. People change their minds over time. What I'm willing to live with and what I'm not willing to live with, that is a moving target. So these are conversations you have over time with yourselves and people you love and your doctors. And then things like a will, very important. And then you mentioned a trust. So unless you want to burden your loved ones with probate, you don't stop at the will, get a trust. And don't just get a trust, sign it and fund the trust. A lot of people think they're done when they did the trust, but they didn't actually fund it, and that's a problem. So these are things, conversation to have with your financial person, with your legal person, with your families. I mean, it is actually, we make it really hard to die. So those are sort of paperwork stuff that's really, really key. Increasingly, sort of a lot of us have lives on social media. So one of the, you guys may, it's really kind of stunningly hard to turn off Facebook accounts and things like that after the death. So and it sets up this very grotesque thing where people are sending Facebook alerts out from a dead person's account, and it just can get really ghoulish. There is increasingly, Facebook is working through this. It's not just Facebook, but there are social media is another way you have to kind of tend to your death. So beyond that, save a bunch of money. Dying, I mean, can you afford to die is the question, is really tricky. We have a whole chapter in our book on this. I think healthcare expenses are the number one cause of personal bankruptcy in our country. And I think it's something like 70% of those who go bankrupt are insured. Yeah. So I think we all think of the insured versus the uninsured. That's not, there's no, insurance ain't enough. So start saving, like now. It's really, really hard, and most of us are going to live with chronic illness for years, and that may mean being out of the workforce for years and being on fixed income for years, whereas we used to get sick and die in a matter of days or weeks. Now it's many, many years. So start saving for it. Sorry, I know this is a very depressing litany, but really, really, really important. So those are sort of logistical things, and then I think moving beyond that, it's sort of the stuff I was referring to with Jeanette and her cigarettes is just sort of a life where you've minimized your regrets. When you actually act on the impulse, when you love someone, you not only tell them, but you act on it. You know, when you want to learn something, you go learn it. You don't continually put things off. This sort of deferred gratification that we do all the time in the name of discipline and other things can really catch up with us in a harsh way. So living yourself, I mean, it's pretty hard to live every day like it's your last. I don't even know if that's possible, and I don't want to be too cheeky here, but do watch if you see your to-do stack of, I wish I had written that person or this person, I wish I needed to talk to, I haven't talked to Aunt Jeannie in forever. You know, if you see that list growing, tend to it. Keep regrets at bay. And then finally, I think what ends up happening, if those of us who are lucky enough to be on the planet for long enough, sort of seems to happen naturally, which is this diffusion of your ego. You know, you get small. I mean, one of the things where I'm happiest is when I realize how nice and small I am. There's a real release in that, and you start seeing value and worth and life outside of yourself. And then all of a sudden you have a pathway to immortality right there. when you die, you're going to dissolve, but your atoms go back, and you're part of this world that keeps on going. I mean, this phrase "end of life" is an important misnomer. It's end of your life. Life will keep going, and as soon as you get in touch with that, whether it's through a faith system or however it gets you there, start caring about the world beyond yourself. That includes yourself. I'm not saying don't include yourself in this. This is not a matter this is not an ascetic pursuit. So anyway, the long answer. Sorry, but this is a really important question. But there's a pretty good list for you. Do those things.
Can you say the name of your book, which is coming out in July and it's
oh.
available on Amazon? and it deals
Thank
with
you,
this
Jim.
topic.
Yeah, A Beginner's Guide to the End. A Beginner's Guide to the End. He misspoke before. He said Beginner's Guide to Death. I wanted to let him be. He's my elder. But but it's A Beginner's Guide to the End. Yeah. And Shoshana Berger is my co-author, and that's coming out in July.
I'm hurt.
Sorry, big guy.
One of the interesting things, and we'll get to your question in just a sec, is that I've seen is you're talking about letting go of your ego. It's fascinating to watch people who are wise get older, because many of us have a tendency to, have our house exactly neat, everything is perfect. But you watch a person as they're heading towards the end, and all that BS doesn't matter anymore, right? They wear the same clothes every day. They're not worried about a little dirt on the floor, a few crumbs or anything like that. And amazingly, they're content and happy because they've let go of this trying to keep everything together and look perfect and have a display for others. They're living for themselves. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, BJ, for a great conversation.
Bless you.
So I think that one of the ways that I prepare is to be loving in a present kind of way, as hard as that is, and as importantly, to express love. BJ, I love you, brother.
I love you too, Anthony.
And, in my 50-something body, I think I'm preparing. My question is really about my mom. So my mom's 80-something, has arthritis, but more importantly in this context is she has Alzheimer's. Her memory is not very good. She doesn't know what day it is, doesn't recognize people, those kinds of things, thinks her parents are alive, doesn't know where she is. And so when I think about her, and I've tried to understand, well, how can we help her prepare, or how is she preparing, when I'm not even sure she knows. I mean, she's in her last chapter. I'm not even sure sort of where her consciousness is to be able to think about death. So I imagine you might have some experience with Alzheimer's patients. And
Yeah, well, so thanks, Anthony. And I really appreciate you sharing. This is a very personal, inherently personal subject, and the more we talk and think out loud together, the better. So thank you. So one caution is while we're compos mentis, it's a good time. Another reason why it's great to not defer these things too long. Oops. But if mom didn't do that, that's okay. That a lot of people don't, for one reason or another. And this gets at one of the probably, if I had to pick one thing to do to kind of prepare yourself at least to navigate the healthcare system through the end of life, is to name your proxy. Someone who's going to be speaking on your behalf when you can no longer speak on your behalf. And that may default to someone in the family, but if you're going to do one thing, do that. And it's not an honorific. It's not to bestow someone with it's actually a really important job. And sometimes that means it's not the spouse. Sometimes it's someone who's going to be able to think soberly on your behalf, not project their wishes, but to speak on your behalf, on your mom's behalf. Did your mom, does she have a healthcare proxy, Anthony, in any official way?
So, yeah, my siblings and I, we've done all the paperwork and all of that kind of stuff, and we feel like we're prepared on that end, and certainly there's all the financial part of it. But, again, I'm more concerned with how she's facing each day, how she thinks about, the direction of her day and her life. Because part of me, in the whole context of this conversation is seeing the end of life as not something to fear, something, in fact, to maybe to look forward to. And it's just a struggle because I don't think we can't have that conversation. She doesn't sort of understand where she is in her life.
And you can actually, sorry, Jim.
No, my only comment was, actually my mother went through that to the point where she didn't even know who I was, and she was not in this world, right? And then, well, again, you're projecting in some sense her humanity, that it still exists, but what happens, unfortunately, sometimes is I think they're gone. And then the question is, who are you making decisions for? Because actually there was a recent experience with a spiritual leader who was a friend of mine who had a massive stroke, and they asked me to come and see him, and it was in his dominant hemisphere, and I told them they should let him die because this is an individual who his words are incredible. He has people surrounding him, and most people at the age of 80s, late 80s, would want that. And I told his followers, you have to be careful about what decision you're making and who it is for, because oftentimes you want to cling on and they're not there, or they actually would not want that, and then you're being selfish. And you have to, I think, be very, very careful about that. But maybe we can ask a couple more questions, and I don't mean to cut you off, but we have a few more.
Can I say one
Yeah,
more
sure.
thing? Sorry, Anthony.
You're my elder. Oh, no.
Because if you can't talk to mom, and if you can't sort of use cognition, your intellect to kind of find your way together, suffering is kind of an amazing thing. You can suffering will show itself. So in your gut, or from a furrowed brow, or from restlessness, your mom will probably show you whether or not in the moment she is getting something from life. Yeah. You don't need a narrative over time. That's why the aesthetic world is so powerful to me. There's a world beyond the intellect. And so your gut, furrowed brow, difficulty breathing, fidgetiness, if she's turning away food, she's telling you that's communication.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Becker.
Thank you.
We'll do this one here since we did a few over here. Go ahead.
This is related to compassion. So how does a patient's experience of compassion impact the choices they make in terms of their care? And in particular, because in Canada we have medically assisted dying. So I just wanted to see if you had experience with
Sure. Well, it's interesting if somebody has the cognitive abilities and they have a perception in their own mind that their presence in this world is causing suffering to others. I think that they have the right to make a decision. Now, oftentimes other things can interfere with that, but in the best sense, if someone is making a decision while they have their mental faculties and they're actually doing it not only to help their own suffering, but also to decrease the suffering of those around them. One of the challenges I have had frequently is in modern society, we don't have, let's say, your parents with you. They live someplace else typically. The siblings are spread all over. And oftentimes those siblings haven't seen their loved ones for a long time or been with them, yet there'll be one sibling who's lived nearby and has sort of been the caregiver. And then when a tragic event occurs, everyone comes, and the people who've been the least there decide now it's time to give their opinion and exercise their decision because of all the guilt they have about ignoring their family member. And this gets into a very, very difficult, I'm sure you've And so you have this one person, I've been taking care of mom for the last 5 years. She told me what she wanted. I'm trying to do it. And it says, you don't know, you're just being selfish because you want everything and you want her to die. That's your only, and you're just like, oh my God. And so I think it is important that you actually take the time to know what the person wants and also have the conversation with siblings, because I have seen this actually destroy relationships among siblings too. When in fact, everyone should come together to make someone's passing at ease, versus now you're having screaming contests outside of the hospital bed. And any of you experienced? Yeah.
And I would say that kind of points me to one of your jobs as a caregiver is self-reflection, because one of the enemies in this is projection. And so I think it's one of the kindest things we can do is be self-aware. And it gets really heated at the end, just as you're saying, Jim. So put that on your list of to-dos.
Now, and one other thing which I found, and you can tell me if you've been had experience with this, I'm a very pragmatic realist, and when it's clearly evident that this person is going to pass, I start having that conversation. Now, a lot of neurosurgeons run away because it can be painful and time-consuming. But that being said, there sometimes, though, is a subset of doctors who, for whatever reason, they want to torture the patient to the absolute end and to assuage their own guilt of failure, that I have done everything possible, yet that what they're doing is causing the patient to suffer horrible, horrible pain. And it's in some ways, you're now no longer caring for the patient, you're dealing with your own ego issues. And I've had a number of conversations about that. So I'm glad we're in agreement on that. Go ahead.
I wanted to go back to your recovery after your traumatic accident, and in learning about post-traumatic growth. The wise teacher here at Stanford said, the rule is, dudes, you have to resist the temptation to point it out to somebody who's suffered a trauma, that you may not be the one to say, hey, there's going to be amazing things you learn, and so you need to zip that. But I'm curious about what influences did you have around you that helped you do that remarkable shift into, I heard you speak in San Francisco where you talked about studying art and plumbing the definition of what it is to be human, and I suspect your mother probably had something to do with it. But can you talk about what helped nurture you and inspire you to do the tremendous growth you have?
Well, thanks for questioning. Yeah, let me think. Well, one is I think I got a running start, as I referenced my mom, and I had grown up with a disabled mother. So a lot of people I met in rehab really it almost felt like a required 1 to 3 year period of hating themselves because they couldn't play football anymore or whatever it was, and they had to just hate their body I got to sidestep all that. My mom had taught me in her example and explicitly that this is just part of life and loss is normal. And one of my favorite things that happens when I've talked to, sometimes I'll give talks with school kids. My favorite thing is when a kid asks me, well, don't you miss having 2 hands? And I'll say, well, yeah, I do, I really do. 2 hands is so lovely. But it's okay. And don't you miss having 3 hands? And they'll say, I always wonder how, if they ever get it. Every once in a while you watch a kid get it because, who are you comparing yourself to? Am I so unlucky to have lost a hand, or am I super lucky to have my dominant hand? This is all very mushy stuff, and you get to say. So I had learned so much from my mother, so I had a kind of a running start. I knew that I wasn't just my body. I knew this thing was going to die anyway. I knew that it was something to work around. I knew that limitations were exactly what get us creatively primed. Talk to an architect. They don't deal with a blank sheet of paper. They got gravity. They got all sorts of material limitations. Limitations are what prime us as humans to find a way through. We were lost without limitations. in some way. They are exactly what make us creative. So I knew all those things already going in, that on some level. That was very helpful. Then, as you referenced, turning my I went back to college and turned my major to art. Because of this question, I wanted to learn perspective. What made a human being a human being? And I had this magnificent campus and this ridiculous course catalog, and I saw it as therapeutic. You know, I'm very proud of myself for seeing that, for the therapeutic potential of my mind, and being in a place where I could cultivate my mind. And studying art taught me how to see. And that was a really huge gift. We human beings, it's stunning. We can change out our lenses. We can change how we see things. That is probably at least my favorite human capacity. And it's so dang therapeutic. This is not a recreational interest, this is a therapeutic one. So I took advantage of what I had there. And then I guess along the way, I just realized that this was, again, not something to overcome, but something to work with, something to use. I would not be doing the work I'm doing if it hadn't happened, right? So I built a life with it. And after a while, I couldn't hate this accident anymore because it brought so much my way. That was the trick.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So first, thank you so much for the discussion that we feel, I think, all honored to be here and listen to this. So I was curious if you have insights or advice for those of us who are interested in being of service in the field of palliative care who don't have a medical background.
Great. So, well, any clinical, so palliative care, you guys know the team is doctor, nurse, social worker, chaplain at least. Do you mean not a doctor or not a clinician?
So I guess not a clinician. I'm hoping that someone else will benefit from this question. I'm a user experience designer, and I'm also interested in mindfulness and meditation. And as I've been learning about palliative care, it just seems like there are so many opportunities and challenges, but it's a bit overwhelming to know where to kind of start and like get oriented. But I just feel very drawn to the mission. So that's, I guess, the context behind why I'm asking.
Great. So I think we could talk for hours on this. So this is why, the book that we referenced, my co-author, Shoshana Berger, she's editorial director at IDEO.
Oh.
She's a designer. Because to me, design thinking is this whole other sort of social science, is a way of if we see illness and death as an experience, well, then we get to create for it and condition it. And that's design. So you can exercise this in all sorts of ways. Directly, you could get involved with design around patient experience, durable medical equipment, adaptive devices, architecture, or indirectly just take on your mission that your work is to be a force in this world that helps people suffer less and love more. You would be, in my mind, a palliative designer if you did that. So you can apply it directly or indirectly.
Also, just to mention, at CCARE, we've developed a compassion cultivation training program that actually is very useful for people who are caregivers or are suffering or dealing with other existential crises. And a lot of people, in fact, one of our teachers, Robert Cusack, deals with a lot of people who are grieving or at end of life types of situations. To be respectful of BJ, he has to pick up his dog up in San Francisco.
In Mill Valley.
In Mill Valley, I'm sorry. And so we're going to have to let him go. Thank you all so much, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.